I came home from work one evening, exhausted but relieved to finally kick back in my own house. Or at least that's what I thought, until I saw the bright red notice plastered across my front door. It was an eviction notice. For my own house. I blinked, thinking this had to be some kind of prank. My heart pounded as I ripped the paper off and read it. The Homeowners Association had officially terminated my right to live here. Confused, I looked around the neighborhood searching for answers. That's when I saw them. Karen, the HOA president, standing at the end of my driveway with her arms crossed, a smug grin stretching across her face. Behind her stood a group of HOA members, whispering among themselves like a pack of vultures. "This isn't a joke, Ethan," she said sweetly in a voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Your family is no longer authorized to reside here. HOA policy. I suggest you leave before we call the authorities." My blood ran cold. This had to be some kind of mistake. My grandfather had left this house to me when he passed away. It had been in our family for decades. I owned it outright. No mortgage, no disputes, no legal loopholes. And yet, somehow, these self-appointed tyrants had decided they could kick me out? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. "Karen, I own this house. You can't just ban me from my own property." Her smile widened, eyes glinting with something almost sinister. "Oh, but we can. You see, your grandfather never followed the HOA's bylaws, and we've been very patient with your family's rebellious attitude. Unfortunately, that patience has run out. The board has voted and your residency is no longer approved." I laughed, though it wasn't funny. That's not how property law works. You can't just vote someone out of a home they own. Karen's expression darkened and she snapped her fingers. "Jerry, show him the paperwork." A balding, rat-faced man stepped forward, shoving a thick stack of documents into my hands. "You've violated Section 14B of the HOA contract," he said smugly. "Unauthorized residence. Since your name wasn't originally on the deed when your grandfather purchased the home, you're considered a new owner, and all new owners must be approved by the HOA board. You weren't." My hands shook with anger as I flipped through the papers. This was insanity. A total fabrication. "This is illegal," I muttered, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. Karen sighed dramatically. "Oh, Ethan. You should have just played along, paid your dues, and been a good neighbor. But instead you disrespected our rules. That's why the board decided to take action." I clenched my jaw. What rules did I even break? Karen's nose wrinkled as she counted on her fingers. "For starters, your lawn isn't the exact shade of green specified in the HOA guidelines. Your car is a non-luxury model, which lowers the property value. And don't get me started on the horror of seeing you hang actual laundry outside. This is a respectable community, Ethan." I was stunned. My heart pounded with frustration and disbelief. These weren't real violations. These were ridiculous excuses designed to force me out. I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could speak, Karen took a step closer and lowered her voice to a whisper. "Besides," she said, smirking, "I don't like the way your father spoke to me at the last meeting. He was rude. I don't tolerate disrespect." That was it. That was the real reason. This wasn't about my lawn, my car, or some made-up HOA rule. This was about control. About power. I clenched my fist. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Karen laughed. "Oh honey. That's cute." I stormed away, dialing my father's number with shaking hands. My father, Judge Reynolds, answered on the first ring. "What happened?" His voice was calm, but I knew him well enough to hear the edge of steel underneath. Dad, they literally banned us from our own house. They're calling it a violation of HOA bylaws. They fabricated some nonsense about unauthorized residency. I'm standing outside right now and Karen is acting like she's won the lottery." There was a brief silence. Then my father's voice turned cold. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. 15 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up and my father stepped out, wearing his usual impeccable suit. His presence alone made the HOA members shuffle uncomfortably. Karen, however, stood her ground, arms crossed. "Ah, Judge Reynolds," she said sweetly. "I was wondering when you'd show up." My father didn't waste time. He extended a hand. "Let me see the so-called legal documents." Jerry, the rat-faced HOA member, hesitated before handing them over. My father took his time reading through every page. Then, without looking up, he chuckled. "I see what you did here, he said, his voice dangerously smooth. You altered the HOA bylaws after my son inherited the house. That's fraud. And this clause about unauthorized residency? Legally unenforceable. Karen's smug grin wavered. Well, the board has authority over the community and we. You have no legal authority to override property ownership, my father interrupted. And any attempt to enforce this fraudulent ruling will result in a lawsuit so catastrophic that the HOA will be bankrupt by the time I'm finished with it. Karen blinked, clearly caught off guard by how quickly things had turned. But then she squared her shoulders and sneered. You wouldn't dare. My father smiled. Try me. A tense silence stretched between them. Finally, Karen scoffed and turned to her HOA cronies. This isn't over, she hissed. We'll see what the city council has to say about this. With that, she stormed off, her followers trailing behind her like lost ducklings. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My father clapped a hand on my shoulder. This isn't over, Ethan. Karen doesn't back down easily. Be ready for whatever she tries next. And as I watched Karen disappear down the street, I had the sickening feeling that he was right. The moment Karen stormed off, I knew this was far from over. My father had shut her down in the first round, but she wasn't the type to accept defeat. In fact, the way she clenched her fists and whispered to her cronies as she walked away made it painfully clear. She was already planning her next move. And she wouldn't play fair. The next morning I woke up to a strange sound outside. At first I thought it was a garbage truck, but when I looked out the window my jaw nearly hit the floor. A tow truck was pulling my car away. I grabbed my keys and sprinted outside in my pajamas. Hey, what the hell are you doing? I shouted. The tow truck driver barely glanced at me as he secured the hooks. Orders from the HOA. Violation of community vehicle standards. I turned and saw Karen standing at the edge of her lawn, sipping her coffee like she was watching a morning talk show. I marched over to her, my fists clenched. You had my car towed? Are you serious? She took a slow, deliberate sip before responding. Of course. Your vehicle is in violation of HOA guidelines. We can't have cheap, non-luxury cars lowering the neighborhood's aesthetic value. I nearly laughed in disbelief. Aesthetic value? It's a brand new car. He shrugged. Not my problem. I didn't even bother arguing. I whipped out my phone and took photos of everything. The tow truck, the charges they were trying to slap on me, Karen's smug expression. Everything. Then I dialed my dad. It took him 5 minutes to call me back, and when he did he was furious. They just made another mistake, Ethan. Call the towing company and get their service agreement in writing. If Karen authorized this personally, she's committing fraud again. I did exactly as he said. The tow truck company hesitated at first, but once I mentioned that my father was a judge and that I would be pursuing legal action, they folded. Turns out the order hadn't come from any official HOA ruling. It was from Karen herself. I got my car back by the afternoon, but by then the next petty attack had already begun. When I returned home, I found an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was an official-looking letter with a fine of $10,000. Violation of community aesthetics. That's what they wrote. No details, no explanation, just an absurd fine for an imaginary offense. My blood boiled as I marched across the street to Karen's house. I knocked on her door, and when she answered, I held up the letter. Are you out of your mind? She barely blinked. Rules are rules, Ethan. I forced myself to take a breath. This is illegal. You can't just fine me whatever amount you feel like. She leaned against the doorframe, a slow smile creeping across her face. Then sue me. That was when I realized exactly what she was doing. She was trying to bury me in fines, fees, and nonsense disputes, hoping I'd get frustrated and leave. She wanted to make my life miserable until I caved. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. Instead, I started digging. I spent hours that evening researching the HOA's history, the bylaws, and, most importantly, Karen herself. What I found was beyond infuriating. Karen had been president of the HOA for nearly a decade. In that time, she had forced multiple families to sell their homes, bullied people into compliance, and raked in thousands of dollars in mysterious HOA fees that had no real justification. Even worse, no one had ever run against her in an election. The few people who tried to oppose her mysteriously ended up with violations, fines, and lawsuits until they packed up and left. The deeper I dug, the more corrupt the entire operation seemed. Money was disappearing from the HOA's budget. Fines were being charged without records of where the money went. Several contractors had been paid for work that was never done. It was a mess, and Karen was right at the center of it. I compiled everything into a file and showed it to my father. He read through it in silence, then exhaled slowly. "She's committing fraud. A lot of it." That was all I needed to hear. We started gathering more evidence. We talked to neighbors, some of whom had been too afraid to speak up before but were now eager to help take Karen down. One woman, an elderly widow named Mrs. Holloway, told us she had been fined $5,000 last year for having a garden gnome in her yard. Another man said his dog had been labeled a community nuisance, despite never leaving his own backyard. The more stories we collected, the clearer it became. Karen had turned this HOA into her own personal kingdom, and she was treating residents like peasants. That night, my father made a few phone calls. One was to a city official he knew. Another was to a lawyer who specialized in HOA corruption cases. And the third call was to a friend in the local news. The next morning, the battle escalated. I walked outside to check my mail, only to find that someone had spray-painted my driveway with the words, "Community Disgrace." My heart pounded as I checked the security camera footage. Sure enough, in the dead of night, Karen's husband had crept onto my property and done the damage himself. This time, I didn't even bother confronting Karen. I just sent the footage to the police. Things happened quickly after that. Within hours, a cop car pulled up in front of Karen's house. She came outside, all fake smiles and pleasantries, but when the officer showed her the footage, her expression darkened. She tried to argue, but it was clear she was rattled. The officer gave her a warning, but the damage had already been done. Word was spreading through the neighborhood that Karen had been caught. That afternoon, I got a call from my father. "Ethan, it's time for the next step." I knew exactly what he meant. We had enough evidence now. The illegal fines, the fraudulent tow order, the falsified bylaws, the embezzlement, it was all coming together. And soon, Karen was going to regret every single move she had made. The moment Karen saw the cop car in her driveway, I knew we had struck a nerve. She wasn't just some overzealous HOA president. She was a full-blown dictator, and for the first time she realized her throne was shaking. The smug, confident smile she usually wore was gone, replaced with something else. Worry, fear, maybe even panic. But she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The next day, I received an official-looking letter in my mailbox. It wasn't an HOA fine this time, it was a lawsuit. Karen had filed a defamation claim against me for spreading misinformation about her and the HOA. It was laughable. She was trying to use the legal system to intimidate me, but unfortunately for her, my father was a judge. I brought the letter to him, and he barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "She's bluffing," he said. "She knows she's in trouble, and this is her way of stalling." I wasn't worried about the lawsuit. It was baseless and wouldn't hold up in court. But I also knew Karen wasn't done pulling tricks. That night, I met with Lucy, one of my few allies in the neighborhood. She was a tech-savvy genius who had been living under Karen's tyranny for years. She had already been digging into HOA records and found some disturbing information. "She's been embezzling money," Lucy said, her voice low as we sat in my living room, sifting through digital records on her laptop. "A lot of it. There are payments listed for services that were never done, fake maintenance fees, and a bunch of consulting payments to companies that don't exist." My stomach twisted. I had suspected Karen was shady, but this was full-on fraud. "Can we prove it?" I asked. Lucy grinned. "Oh, we can do more than that. We can expose her." The next morning, I sent everything we had to my father's lawyer friend. He confirmed what we already knew. Karen wasn't just abusing her power. She was breaking the law. We didn't go public immediately. We wanted to make sure we had everything locked down before the final strike. In the meantime, Karen kept up her desperate attempts to push me out. She sent another fake violation, this time accusing me of excessive noise disturbances. I hadn't even been home the night she claimed the incident happened. It was ridiculous, but it was clear she was trying to drown me in paperwork. She also started turning the remaining HOA members against me, spreading lies that I was trying to destroy the neighborhood, and that I hated the community. A few people bought into it, but more and more of my neighbors were starting to see the truth. Then came the final straw. One evening I heard a commotion outside. When I stepped onto my porch, I found two men in work uniforms digging up my front yard. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted. One of the workers wiped sweat from his forehead. "We got an order from the HOA to remove your driveway. Said it was a violation." My mouth fell open. "A violation? You can't just tear up my property." "Sorry, sir, but we were told this was authorized." I knew exactly who had done it. Karen. She was getting desperate and she was taking her pettiness to a whole new level. I immediately called my father. He didn't even sound surprised. "I think it's time," he said simply. I agreed. That night Lucy and I compiled everything. The fake fines. The fraudulent tow order. The doctored HOA bylaws. The footage of Karen's husband vandalizing my driveway. And most importantly, the financial records that proved she had been embezzling thousands of dollars from homeowners. The next morning we went public. First, we sent everything to the local news. Within hours, a report aired about corruption in the HOA, featuring interviews from neighbors who had suffered under Karen's rule. The news station even ran a segment on the financial fraud. Then we sent an official complaint to the city council. We backed it up with evidence and statements from residents. And since my father had connections, the complaint didn't just sit on someone's desk. It went straight to the right people. By that evening, Karen's world was crumbling. A city investigator showed up at her door. They had received multiple reports of fraud and financial mismanagement. Karen tried to put on her usual act, but it didn't work. The investigator wasn't some scared homeowner. He was a government official and he had a warrant to look through HOA records. Karen's face was pale when she saw it. But the real bomb dropped 2 days later when we got word that the HOA's bank accounts had been frozen. A full investigation was underway. And just like that, Karen had lost the one thing she cared about most: her power. She tried to hold a neighborhood meeting to do damage control, but nobody showed up. People were finally done with her. Then just when I thought things couldn't get any better, Karen got hit with something she couldn't ignore: criminal charges. Fraud. Embezzlement. Forgery. She was finished. The neighborhood was eerily quiet the morning Karen's empire finally crumbled. The usual tension that hung in the air, the fear of being watched, the paranoia of stepping a toe out of line, it was gone. People were stepping onto their porches, talking freely, something they hadn't done in years. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted. Karen's reign of terror was officially over. The real fun began when the police showed up at her house. I was sipping my morning coffee when I saw the flashing lights reflect off my living room window. I didn't even have to step outside to know what was happening, but I did anyway. Karen stood in the doorway, arguing with 2 officers. She was still trying to weasel her way out, insisting that everything was a misunderstanding. That she was being unfairly targeted. That this was all some kind of conspiracy against her. But the officers weren't having it. One of them handed her a folder. "We have evidence of financial fraud, misappropriation of funds, and multiple falsified HOA documents. We need you to come with us for questioning." Karen's face twisted in fury. "I am the HOA president. This is MY community. I make the rules." The officer didn't flinch. "Not anymore, ma'am." The moment the cuffs clicked around her wrists, the entire neighborhood erupted into cheers. I couldn't help but laugh. Karen's arrest wasn't just about the fraud. It wasn't just about the illegal fines, the extortion, or the threats. It was justice for years of bullying, years of making people feel powerless in their own homes. As she was shoved into the back of the police car, she locked eyes with me. There was no smugness left. No fake smile. Just pure, unfiltered rage. "This isn't over," she spat through the window. "You'll regret this." I grinned. "I doubt that." The car drove off, leaving behind nothing but the memory of a woman who had lost everything. With Karen out of the picture, the HOA board collapsed almost immediately. Most of the members who had supported her were either involved in the fraud or too scared to take charge without her. One by one they resigned until there was no one left. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. At the next community meeting, we voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. People who had been fined ridiculous amounts got their money refunded. Unfair restrictions were lifted. Homeowners finally had control over their own properties again. Lucy was elected as the new neighborhood representative, not because she wanted power, but because everyone trusted her to make sure no new tyrant ever took over. A week after Karen's arrest, my father and I stood outside our house, watching as the remnants of her reign faded away. The once pristine HOA office was now just an empty building. The ridiculous compliance officers were gone. The constant fear of absurd fines had disappeared. I turned to my dad and smirked. "Well, that was fun." He chuckled. "You handled it well." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean you handled it well?" He smiled knowingly. "Let's just call it a team effort." I couldn't argue with that. A few days later, I got an update. Karen had officially been charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. If convicted, she was facing serious prison time. Her house, once the symbol of her power, was now up for sale. No one in the neighborhood wanted it. No one even wanted to look at it. It was like an unspoken agreement. We were done with Karen. The best part? The ridiculous HOA rules she had enforced for so long were gone. People started painting their houses whatever color they wanted. One guy put up a 10-foot statue of a gnome just to make a point. Someone else turned their front lawn into a mini amusement park for kids. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like home. Karen had tried to take everything from me. My house, my peace, my rights. But in the end, she lost everything. And I got to sit back and enjoy the show.